All right, so most ecological resources are partially distributed. Examples would include forests of trees, herd of deer, and marine organisms such as phytoplanktons. And not surprisingly, resource distributions influence cognitive evolutions. In fact, several studies have suggested that patchy distributions favor the evolution of particular types of cognitive strategies for search. Such studies have not only looked at patchiness in food, but also patchiness in other informational domains like the internet, social partners, semantic memory, and others. However, most of such studies only explore the unidirectional influence of cognition and patchiness. Hence, in such studies, typically patchiness is assumed fixed and its influence on cognition is observed. But in our current work, we are interested in studying the mutual interaction of patchiness and cognition. This is based on the idea that ecological resource distributions are not static, but are emergent and dynamic. And they're very much impacted by the consumption behavior and cognition of agents interacting with them. So patchiness should not only influence cognition, but should also be influenced by it. We studied this interaction in an agent-based model. In our model, we first start with an empty toroidal world, and we then introduced a resource-level agent, which we call plants. The plants can grow, that is, they consume some uniformly distributed resource, something like sunlight, and they reproduce. So that's why if these plants are left unchecked, they become uniformly distributed across the grid. We then introduced a cognitive agent, which we called animals. These agents consume plants and they're capable of evolving some cognitive abilities. We expect that across a simulation, animals will evolve cognitive abilities of locating food. Further, we expect that their cognition-driven consumption behavior will influence plant distributions. And finally, plant distributions will in turn influence cognition, leading to some kind of cyclical interaction of animal cognition and plant distributions. In the slide, on the left-hand side is everything that we had set up in our agent-based model, and everything on the right is what we expected to evolve or emerge as a result of what we had set up in our model. All right, so we studied this model in 3 experiments. In experiment 1, we studied the agent-based model which I just described, in which both cognition and patchiness was free to evolve or emerge. Hence, in these simulations, cognition of animals could influence the patchiness of plants and vice versa. In experiment 2, cognition was fixed at varied levels and patchiness was free to emerge. Therefore, here we focus on the unidirectional influence of cognition on patchiness. And finally, in experiment 3, patchiness was concurrently fixed at varied levels and cognition was free to evolve to give us the influence of patchiness on cognition. So these 3 experiments together give us a pretty holistic understanding of how cognition and patchiness influence each other or interact. All right, so in our simulations, plants and animals engage in some basic behaviors. Plants ate an invisible, uniformly distributed resource, something like sunlight, and they gained energy through that. Animals gain energy by consuming plants. Both plants and animals were also reproduced asexually. So if they reach some energy threshold, they could also metabolize, that is, they lost some amount of energy on every time step. Both plants and animals could also die if they weren't able to eat for several time steps and they kept losing energy through metabolizing. These basic behaviors regulated the population levels of both the agents. And in addition to these basic behaviors, our animals were capable of movement and cognition. So this leads us to the question of what is cognition? Imagine that you are this animal agent in this 2-dimensional world looking for plants to eat. You are trying to decide which of the 8 neighboring cells you should move to in the very next step. So you're trying to figure out which of these cells will bring you the most amount of food in the near future. You evaluate the very first neighboring cell. So you use your smell-like perception to determine how much food you can get from that cell, as well as other cells that are close to it. Your blue is that perceptual strength, and it might decay with distance to discount the value of more distant food. And in a similar manner, you use your perception to evaluate the food value of all your other neighboring cells. Finally, you would make your movement decision based on the food value of these cells. So if a cell will bring you more food in the near future, you're more likely to move there. Here, green signifies its probability of moving to a cell. It is therefore darker for cells which have more food close to them, and it is lighter for cells which do not have much food close to it. And this process basically provides us with like a very simple idealized model of search. And in our simulation, this entire process was done through two cognition parameters, a perceptual strength and decision determinacy, and each animal agent had its own value of these two parameters that determine its search behavior. So essentially, in our model, perceptual strength determine how far and with how much strength an animal could perceive. And over here, I've given examples of what low to high perception looked like. And decision determinacy determined how deterministic or stochastic an agent's movement was. So at low values of this parameter, as seen in this bottom left figure, the agent just moved around stochastically. So it could move to any of the neighboring cells with equal probability, regardless of the amount of food. And in very high values of decision determinacy, the agent moved very deterministically to the cell which had the highest amount of food. So both of these parameters lie between 0 and 1, and these parameters could evolve. So parents passed on their parameter values to their offspring with some mutation. All right, so this leads us to the concurrent question of what is patchiness. As I have mentioned before, patchiness in our simulations emerged through agent interactions. We therefore, throughout our simulation, kept track of the amount of patchiness that was existing in our grid, and we measured it using the nearest neighbor metric. So the figure below provides an example of how this metric works. As you can see in the bottom left figure, when plants are pretty randomly distributed across the grid, patchiness was 0, and as plants became more and more clumped, the measured patchiness values increased. All right, so since we discussed the methods, I can move on to the results. And as I mentioned earlier, in the first experiment, we studied the mutual interaction of cognition and patchiness. The bottom left plot out here shows what the patchiness and the cognition parameters look like across the simulation. So on the x-axis is the step number of the simulation, the y-axis is the parameter values. Patchiness is in red, decision determinacy is in green, perceptual strength is in blue. And on this right-hand side grid is basically what our world will look like at the end of a simulation. And as you can see, there is considerable patchiness in the grid. So this leads us to the first point, which is that patchiness of resources in our simulations emerged through intrinsic agent interactions. We also find that cognition parameters and patchiness increase initially and later stabilize, as can be seen in this figure out here. And finally, we see that the parameters displayed rough oscillatory patterns. And this point becomes more relevant later in the presentation, so you can probably keep that in mind. All right, so before I move on to the results of experiment 2, I want to just show show a little snippet of our simulation so you can understand more of what our model looked like. So I'm going to be showing a video. I'm going to be showing a video now, and on the left-hand side, this video will show you the simulation which I just discussed. So this is what I showed in experiment 1 right now. And just for comparison, I'm showing one more video in which agents are just moving about randomly in the grid. So yeah, I'm just going to play it now. All right, so on the left-hand side, like I said, the agents are evolving cognition and moving about in a specific way. And in the right-hand side, they're just moving about randomly. This is just a snippet from the middle of the simulation. Each simulation begins with a uniform distribution of plants. So whatever patchiness you're seeing in the grid right now is a result of agent movement later on in the simulation. And as you can see, there is quite a bit of patchiness that has emerged out here. All right, so now that we've kind of discussed the dynamical interaction of patchiness and cognition, I wanted to break this interaction a little bit more and keep cognition and patchiness both fixed in experiment 2 and 3 respectively. So in experiment 2, we focus on the influence of cognition and patchiness, so cognition is fixed. So in this figure, the x-axis is decision determinacy, which is fixed at 11 different values going from 0 to 1. And on the y-axis, there's perceptual strength, which has been similarly fixed. So each grid cell in this figure is a specific combination of the two cognition parameters. And the darkness of red indicates how much patchiness there was in those simulations. So as a whole, you can see that lower perceptual strength and greater decision determinacy led plants to become more patchy in our simulations. And we believe that in these simulations, since agents were short-sighted and had little stochasticity, they remained in local regions of plant density. So essentially this interaction led to many plant areas which were highly exploited and other plant areas which were less exploited, leading to sort of patchiness in the overall grid. The star which I have in this figure is basically represents the cognition parameters that evolved in the previous experiments, in experiment 1. And as you can see, basically mid-range values of the decision determinacy and perceptual strength had evolved, leading to some amount of patchiness. All right, so now that I've discussed the results of experiment 2, I'm going to move on to experiment 3, which, as I mentioned earlier, focuses on the influence of patchiness on cognition. So here patchiness is fixed. In both of these figures on the right, the x-axis is the amount of is patchiness, which is fixed again at 11 different values, and on the y-axis is the specific cognition parameter. So in figure A, basically the top figure shows the influence of patchiness on perceptual strength, and as we can see, there's a sort of an upward trend out here. And the bottom figure shows the influence of patchiness on decision determinacy, and as you can see, there's sort of a more downward trend out here. So as a whole, we see that as patchiness increased, animals evolved higher values of perceptual strength, but lower values of decision determinacy. And we believe that the perception increased with patchiness because greater perception allowed agents to identify and move toward larger patches. Therefore, perception was adaptive in patchy environments. However, decision determinacy did not provide much advantage in an autocorrelated environment in where it was patchy. And we believe that this is because in patchy environments, if an agent was already in a fertile grid cell, it was likely to remain in a fertile grid cell regardless of which direction it moved into. So determinacy was less essential to survival in a patchy environment, but it was sort of more essential to survival in a more random environment. So here I've discussed the influence of patchiness and cognition, and I've completed my results, and I'm going to now move on to the summary and takeaways. And the important takeaway of this entire study was that patchiness in resource environments emerged intrinsically through agent interactions. And this probably provides some hints about why patchiness is so common in the real world. In our simulations, simple agent behaviors of locating food produce patchiness. Another important takeaway that we saw was that in our simulations, cognitions and patchiness parameters, we found regulated each other. So they sort of created a self-regulating system, and I'll discuss this a little bit further. So for instance, if we look at the interaction between determinacy and patchiness in experiments 2 and 3, we find that as patchiness reduces, decision determinacy increases. But when decision determinacy increases, it pulls patchiness values higher, which in turn leads to a fall in decision determinacy and fall in patchiness. So these parameters interact in a way that prevents either from becoming very extreme. And this links us back to the first experiment. If you might remember, this is the plot that I had shown earlier. And here we saw some kind of oscillatory movements. And we believe that the pattern of interaction I just discussed is responsible for these oscillatory movements, because as decision determinacy increases, patchiness increases, but this results in a fall in decision determinacy and then a fall in patchiness. And over here, I've only shown the interaction between decision determinacy and patchiness, but we found similar patterns of interaction between perceptual strength and patchiness. So in general, we saw that the search behaviors and the cognitive search behaviors of animals and the patchiness of plants interacted in ways that prevented either from becoming too extreme, so it produced a self-regulating system. All right, so that's all I had for today. Thank you. You can find the code and supplemental materials at this link.
Great. Thank you so much for your talk. We have time for one question if somebody would like to ask one. Okay, so there's a question in the chat. Ditlev, if you would like to ask your question, otherwise I'll read it.
Yeah, hey. I was just wondering if you have considered how different classes of foods would affect the search behavior of these agents, and also in relation to the patches or the patchiness.
Yeah, so we haven't conducted simulations where like different foods have different amounts of attraction or different amounts of nutrition that they provide. But that is something that can be done in the future. We will be interested in seeing in a bunch of different resource and environments how it interacts. We would also be interested in how it works if food is, for instance, moving, and that probably can lead to something of swarming and schooling behavior. So yeah, we still have to look at a bunch of different types of food environments. This is just the initial thing.
All right.